Unfortunately, Dominique Bon was unable to attend for understandable reasons, and we are very lucky to have James McKee here filling in for her. James has some wonderful experience making things happen in government, if you can believe it. And so I am delighted to hand it over to him to share a little bit about what the Digital Innovation Office of the Government of Alberta is doing, and perhaps even what it aspires to do in the coming years. When we talk about myths and realities involving AI, it's really helpful to know what justice and government institutions are thinking and where they're at. So really appreciate both Justice Engels and yourself, James, coming to join us today. So with that, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for having me here. I'll do my best to be more than a pale imitation of Dominic, who is the chief officer and ADM and kind of guiding light behind this office that I work for. So I will give you maybe my usual sort of 2-minute elevator pitch, who we are, what we do, and then maybe I can respond to some of the comments made by Justice Inglis and others and give you a sense of what it is that government's actually trying to do. So with that, the Digital Innovation Office is about 3 and a bit years old. We were created, I don't know, to be a little bit of a sort of challenge function, to provide a challenge function to sort of approach things a bit differently in government. It's not a new notion, the work that we're doing. Many other jurisdictions, provincially, federally, down in the US, all over Europe, Australia, Estonia, you name it, there's a million examples from which we can draw upon. And in fact, we kind of get to take the best and drop some of the mistakes that have been made in the past. And we are, broadly speaking, trying to change the way governments think about and then deliver digital services. And it begins first with, and I will maybe pick up on a comment that Justice Inglis just made about sort of, is the court a service or is it a place or something in between? And that's one of the things that we are very much interested in thinking about from within the government, is capturing both of those kinds of concerns or both of those considerations in how we do what are, in some instances, very kind of like IT focused. We're building a thing that people do something on. You have to provide a record, you have to apply for something, you have to apply to law school, for example. But we do so with a lot of care and attention paid to the kind of groundedness, the humanity of it, the ways in which people actually live their lives and conduct themselves, and people who may have accessibility issues, or people who live remotely, or there's lots of different ways in which we have to think about those things. And so what we have been able to do in the last 3 years is to import a slightly different way of working. One of the things that we're more interested in is not just saying, oh, you have a problem, you need to run court online in the middle of a global pandemic. Here's some technology that will help you do that. That technology, as WebEx has been shown, may well work, but maybe we should check first. And so that's some of the work that we've been doing, is setting up the capacity for government not only to provision the technology and to build software and to buy software and to install it and so on, but also to begin to think about how and why people use the tools that they're provided, with an eye to kind of improving or substituting new tools so that they might get a better experience. And that's part of how we're trying to reorient a lot of what the government does. So how do we do that? Well, we put together small teams. First, we copy from other people who've done this successfully. We try to more holistically approach the problems that government has, and government has many problems. We have to deliver services in the middle of a global pandemic, as we noted. But it's also got to deliver things in a way that are more cost-effective, more resource-effective. It's an abiding, evergreen kind of consideration for government that we spend too much money and we have to find what we're calling red tape reductions, trying to make things easier for people, the average Albertan, who interacts with government a lot more than you might realize. And so we do that by spending an awful lot of time talking to the people who are our sort of users, right? So we do a lot of user-focused research. And it's not that that's a novel approach necessarily, but we sort of put a certain weight on that orientation. And so I'll give you maybe an example quickly, and then I'll get into some of the work that we've done in the justice space as well. We have, among the very first projects that we ever worked on, I was the lead of the team, and it was a kind of refresh and a revamp and a rebuild of a subsidy for childcare. So parents who fall below a certain income level are able to apply for a subsidy to help cover the cost of childcare. It was a system that had been built in the 1990s. Much of it was paper or even fax-based in some cases. No one had ever actually gone out and asked parents or childcare providers or any of the other stakeholder groups to sort of figure out, like, how do you interact with the government? We just assume that you submit your application and then we get it, and then we say, yes, you can have some money, or no, you can't. And it turned out to be far more complex than that. And in fact, we ended up spending probably 2 years where we're finally at a point now where we have some sense of how to do the work effectively, how to replace the technology in the background, how to bring in the people who conduct the policy analysis, to direct some sort of legislative updates and make some other minor tweaks to replace a system that would take, 2 to 3 to 6 months for someone to apply for a subsidy to something that's relatively speaking instantaneous now. Now, is that a major overhaul of the delivery of a service? I think so, because I was involved in it and because we saw the difference that it made, having talked to, I think it was about 65 people in total. Parents, childcare providers, First Nations, rural, in cities, high income, low income, you name it. We tried to get a cross section of everybody. And we realized that a lot of the services that we were instructed to build at the outset, we didn't actually need at all. And so we built the things that people would use. And we built them in small increments instead of a kind of like, we're going to build a gigantic IT thing and then you can have it. And instead built small incremental things and kept checking back with the users to say, does this still provide the service that we thought it would provide you? And if it didn't, we can quickly change it, because working in code is relatively inexpensive. You can make a series of small bets about what you're building instead of building a comprehensive thing. Governments are very good at paperwork and security and risk analysis and sort of trying to build the thing that everybody wants. And in fact, that often proves very difficult. So we've been doing a lot of that work in the JSG ministry and with the courts, and we do it in a way that allows us to partner in very small groups so that the scope of the work can remain very narrow and focused, and allows us to progress along what we call velocity, the velocity of a project, so we can build things quickly. Justice Inglis mentioned some of the work that we have in various stages of development. So there's court case management, there's a digital transcripts service that we've been working on, there's adjournments, there's surrogate filing, there's a broader filing service. But one of the things I wanted to highlight maybe is just how we built a traffic tickets service. Now, there were traffic ticket services already available through the government of Alberta, but we actually went to traffic courts all over the province and talked to people who were in line trying to pay or dispute their traffic tickets to figure out what it's like, what the experience for them is, so that they can, maybe dispute it or get a reduction, and realize that people don't really care too much about it. If they've been caught speeding, they're happy to pay their fine. Maybe they can't pay it all at once. But what they don't want to do is to line up in a court, and they don't want to use the traffic ticket service the payment service that we had made available to them online. So after a couple of months of research, including going to the Airdrie Traffic Court and learning that that traffic court gets shut down by the fire department often because there's too many people. We actually have a video somewhere. Someone walking along the lines of people sneaked around the courthouse waiting to get in to pay or dispute their tickets. And instead, we built over time and launched it last summer over 5 months, kind of extending the circle of access to people across the province, to a digital payment service that allows people to just pay it in installments, to ask to dispute it, to contest it, a bunch of other services that are in there. And it rolled out so successfully that there are thousands and thousands of interactions every week. And to an earlier point, it allows us to now begin to actually reduce some of the backlog for people who are waiting in court now from ticket disputes that they had tried to dispute months and months, if not years ago. It is a kind of capsule, sort of a capsule or distillation of the approach, in that we had a very small team. Like, these were kind of 6 or 8 people who worked with the traffic tickets people. We had someone from the courts who came and served as a subject matter expert and allowed us to proceed, as I say, in these small ways, keeping an eye on what it is that users actually do, not what we hope that they're going to do, and allows people a certain dignity when they want to interact with the courts that, maybe I just can't afford to pay my ticket. I'm going to, but I can't pay it all at once. Can I pay it in installations? Now, I'm sort of rushing through this because I'm trying to leave some time at the end if you have any questions. But the point is that I wanted us to kind of have a sense of how and why the Digital Innovation Office is involved in the justice space, and how it is that these projects, and we continue to work and bring on other projects. My role is sort of at the leading edge of all of that. So I help both develop a kind of intake process. So we're looking for projects that are sort of fit with this model and have a team from a ministry that can come and work with us. And there's a bunch of other things wrapped up into it. But it's also to say that we spend an awful lot of time talking to users and not thinking a lot about the technologies that we intend to use, or not necessarily dictating, there's many three-letter acronym vendors who can give you a great platform to do any of the things that courts need to do, but instead to do it in a way that does not preclude us trying something and stopping because we realize it doesn't work. That includes, and this is my very awkward segue into the realm of machine learning and advanced artificial intelligence and robotic process and automation, and all the kinds of things that we as a government are trying to make sense of and to use or incorporate in how we deliver services. And so I'll stress it again because I don't think I have made it clear enough yet. The ways in which projects that are typically deemed sort of IT projects, things that we think are services that require an app on your phone, that require you to submit documentation as part of an application, they are only successful, and it's been proven time and time again in jurisdictions all around the world, they're only successful when you speak to the users first and you don't decide the technology first. Now, it's an obvious, perhaps, point to make, but it's one that has been borne out in the success of the projects that we've been able to launch. Some of our colleagues and friends that work for the federal government have actually begun to track some of the successes of the larger projects against the smaller ones. And the larger ones are always delayed, over budget, and sometimes tend not to be completed at all. They're abandoned because it's just too much to do. And so this small incremental development in parallel with policy change, I heard Justice Inglis mentioning that the surrogate service actually requires some legislative updates. There are policy changes that we have to address. And so we're trying to bring together comprehensively sort of cross-functional teams who build things, but also manage legislative agendas, who also manage a kind of interaction with our executive and our political leadership, and at the same time do an awful lot of user-focused testing and research. Now, all of that is a long-winded way of saying that our entry into the machine learning and artificial intelligence space is one that is fraught for a couple of reasons. Fraught, but primarily fraught, I think, at least from the vantage point of the Digital Innovation Office, by the fact that we don't want to choose the technology first and then find problems that technology is possibly a solution to. And instead, we want to identify good problems and figure out what those problems are, come up with a way to kind of order them and rank them in priority. And we do that with the ministries that we work with. We have project teams that are working. I think there's 25 or 26 of us now who are running projects all over government in almost every ministry, and we continue to expand. JSG, I think, has maybe 6 teams working on all of the components, the adjournment services and so on. But we don't want to step first by saying machine learning is the solution, and now we're going to go find the problem. It really is, and I can't stress this enough, an approach that says there are good, meaty, weighty problems that need to be addressed. And they can be of many types, right? It could just be, it's very expensive to continue to provide this service. It takes a lot of people to ingest paper. It takes a lot of court clerks to manage the docket. There's a million examples across government. And machine learning probably lends itself to some of those quite readily. Because, and this has been my view and the view of my colleagues, I happen to be in my job. One part of my job is to sort of set up and sustain and develop a kind of machine learning and sort of data analytics and performance analytics shop that will support each of these services that we build in partnership with ministries and others. And so I think about this a lot. And we do think that there are opportunities, broadly speaking, for machine learning to perform, I don't want to say rudimentary tasks, but simpler tasks that free people to do more interesting work, that free them to do other higher value work. It allows us, I do work for government, so we are often tasked with finding cost savings and efficiencies, and we're also very much interested in doing that. And so I think it's fair to say that the government of Alberta is in its earliest steps. I mean, governments by their nature are large and risk averse and sort of small c conservative in their approach. And so we've been talking about things like we're going to cloud since 2007. We're going to start using machine learning since 2009, but we're finally there. There are a number of efforts that have popped up across the government. I happen to be involved in some of them. And so it's worth thinking about these sort of early emergent kind of nascent prospects as a kind of guide path to where we think government and the government services that we support the courts and others in building might end up. So I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of non-controversial uses, right? It's really easy for us to use machine learning to process data, to move data around, to find data. It helps us make resource allocation decisions. So we're working on a pilot with the people that manage wildfires, for example. And we use historical weather data and it's a fairly complex model. I wouldn't pretend to explain it to you beyond that. It's a fairly complex model that allows us to make automated decisions about wildfire suppression, which is another way of saying we think there's going to be fires in that part of the province, and we should probably send our fire teams up there. And we should do it, a little more effectively and efficiently so that we're not suddenly faced with an overwhelming fire as we saw in Fort McMurray in 2015. Or actually 2016, sorry. But it's a way to kind of allow a machine to make decisions on our behalf that are simple, right? We have some data that the model predicts that these are the outcomes, and therefore a human can begin to review those outcomes. We do a lot of stuff like that. We're doing pilots around collision reporting, so we can kind of say, wow, there's an awful lot of traffic accidents that happen at that intersection. Maybe we should tell the people who, put up traffic lights or who build bridges or whatever it is, here's the data that shows you can make better and smarter decisions so that we keep the cost down for Albertans and we reduce costs to the insurance industry, we keep people safer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are, early efforts to move a kind of step beyond that sort of, I don't want to keep calling it rudimentary, but it's sort of a simplified tool set that we can offer. We are looking at ways to have algorithms look at sentiment analysis so that when people write into the government, we can tell if it's a specific request, because the government gets an awful lot of emails and phone calls and faxes and all kinds of correspondence. So it allows us to say this is, a form letter. It's a really angry person who doesn't actually want something from us. They just want to express their views on a particular topic. And it allows us to kind of assign work to people that sort of says, okay, here's a pile of people who are deeply concerned about issue X. And because we have an obligation to respond to everybody that writes, it simplifies some of that process for us. You can imagine, like people who are applying for disaster relief, speaking of the Fort Mac fires, or emergency benefits, people who are applying, you can imagine simplifying the documentation process. You can imagine using machine learning to look for fraud, right? Detects fraud. There are a number of people who are applying from a part of the province. The postal code is not in the zone where a fire is. So are these people committing fraud? Well, the machine's not going to tell us, but certainly we can hand that off to people who are going to consider it. So there are lots of use cases for AI, but I want to provide the caution that it is a tool like many others. From my vantage point, we don't want to lead from tool first, tool in search of a problem. We instead want to lead with a sense of what are the big problems and what are the appropriate tools, having spoken to the people who deal with the problem every day. It could be law students who are applying for jobs. It could be people applying for a childcare subsidy. It could be a business trying to ask a question about the taxes it submitted or the royalties it was going to receive. Like, there's a million things and ways in which we interact with government. It becomes another tool set, I guess, is my foundational problem, or my foundational framing of the problem. And I think it's fair to say that AI is not just another tool, maybe, is the last caveat that I'll offer in my remarks. It's not just a tool in the way that someone can say, I want to order 10,000 widgets. I need 100 chairs. I need 50 photocopiers for government. because AI is not just a widget, right? And it takes a lot of thoughtful consideration, both from a kind of ethical standpoint. So there's a significant amount of work that's being undertaken now in government and elsewhere, obviously. And I know that some of the guests on the speaking roster today have dealt with it, to sort of think about how we use information. There are considerations around just developing artificial intelligence models themselves. They're difficult. It takes a lot of experience and a lot of capacity and a lot of good data. Governments don't always have good data in the way that can be consumed by a machine learning algorithm. So I have in the past used a slide as part of a presentation to our senior leadership who are very interested in this kind of work, who say, well, we'll get the data and we'll do this with it. And I can say, well, Minister, here's a picture of what the data looks like. And it's endless rows of cabinets filled with paper. And unfortunately, we're going to have to convert that data into something that a machine can consume first. An obvious step, but one that we tend to overlook to a degree because we get excited about the prospects for tools of the future, I guess you could say. So I don't want to come up with any particular kind of advice to the legal profession, to the courts, and through our interactions in these projects, right, the traffic tickets and so on, except to say that machine learning is a great tool. It is a more complex tool, perhaps, than we might otherwise realize. It takes a lot of work and thinking, and it's not something that you can kind of say, oh, now we have WebEx and we can all use it, and there's some implementation questions, and is it more effective in terms of security than Zoom or something else? I thought some people in the chat talking about that the models and how we develop the models are not fraught, but contain an awful lot of things that we have to think about. And so it's actually not ironic, but helpful that governments as large risk-averse organizations actually are pausing a little bit to think more carefully about how we introduce these. They are just tools, but they can be tools that offer all kinds of promise, right? Like we can begin to use artificial intelligence to pull data sets from different disparate locations to be able to deliver insights that we weren't able to produce in the past, or we couldn't without a great deal of effort. And we do that against a context in which governments are continually looking for ways to cut costs, to reduce resourcing and staff, and to then be able to say, you know what, here's a thing that a user, any Albertan, would have ever had access to in the past. This is a service that we weren't able to give to you. And now through these interactions that I've been talking about, based on user research and user experience, and just thinking in terms of service design, new and more improved and higher value for the Albertan services are available to us. I see Hero has come up to the stage, so I will take that as a sign to stop talking.
I could listen to you talk for another hour. Thank you so much for your remarks. I just want to make sure we have time for a couple of questions, if that's okay. But if you had a few more closing notes. Okay, perfect. I guess the first one that strikes me is I really appreciated your notes about sort of not making AI a hammer and everything else a nail, as it were, sort of that it's first there's purpose and then there's things that might meet that purpose. And one of the things you mentioned when you were talking about building your team was using machine learning and AI for learning, like for understanding, like what are people looking for when they contact government? How can we see in aggregate people who contact government rather than it sort of going to the millions of different endpoints that people try, and being able to understand things differently as a public service. And I was just curious if you could talk a little more about that. Like, how do you imagine that AI can just help your team do sense making or understand the system or the problems better, even aside from any solutions?
I mean, I certainly wouldn't claim it could do it better than it is done now by human beings who have reason and practice and good judgment. But it is to say that elements of that sense making, I think, can be replaced by machines. So one of the reasons that we're thinking about this is just because it's very expensive to have a staff who can complement a cabinet or ministers who actually do need to respond to their constituents. But it's also helpful to us beyond that more immediate sense of we must respond to every correspondence, and we had 44,000 emails yesterday, to be able to say, you know, as we try to, I don't know, develop a more robust capacity to engage with the public, shall we say, that there's a lot to do, right? There's a lot of angry people, as we have seen in the last few weeks across Canada, whose interactions are maybe not, like, they don't really actually want to talk to government so much. Or there are people who are trying to get their voice heard amid the noise. And there are tools that allow it. And it's still early days. In my previous life, I'm a reformed academic, and I was studying emotions and public policy at the University of Toronto. And one of the things that I was particularly keen to think about in terms of how policy signals are received from the public, such as they are anymore, was how do we capture public sentiment? How do we know that the public wants a thing, or loves a thing, or hates a thing, or is angry about a thing? And there are people who have been trying for at least a dozen years since I was last thinking about this stuff. And we haven't gotten a whole lot further, right? So we call it sentiment analysis. There are a couple other phrases to describe it. It's good. It's okay. I've seen efforts from Google and others that can capture some of it, but it's not there yet. It's not fine-grained enough yet. And I think the use cases, in my instance, right, the government wants to know better how to respond to the right people in the right way. You're just giving me, you know, you're one of 12,000 people who sent a form letter complaining about a thing. It's not that we treat it differently, but we want to be able to see the one person who is a stakeholder on this particular project who doesn't know that they can't call their MLA or write a letter to cabinet. They're submitting it through a regular channel, as it were. It allows us at least the prospects of capturing those voices. And it does, in the broad sense, allow government to know, yes, people are in fact quite upset about a thing. And we hope still, naively so perhaps, that public sentiment is a way to capture the voice of the public in a kind of simplified way. And if we can do that better through tools that, you know, sort of are better than humans at times, then I'm all for it.
Thank you very much for that. We also have a comment that I think has an implicit question in it about fraud detection and using a word that I know governments tend to be allergic to, debacle. And if you have any thoughts about, you know, sort of, there's always a dark side to trying new things, and sometimes things trip up. So there was an example here about the Michigan AI fraud detection debacle, and
yeah, it is a very loaded domain to have to begin to think about. And I think the perils and whatever the opposite of a virtue is, the vices of using machine learning without thinking through the ethical considerations are plain to see, right? There are many more examples that we know. And so that's why I say it is inherently a virtue in the sense that government is very cautious about using these tools as being as cautious as we can, and developing these kind of AI and ethics models that govern how we use the tools. Now, I use fraud as just an example, sort of kind of off the top of my head, but I'm sure governments are thinking about it, and governments have tried to do it before. The bias of the model captures the bias of the people who build the model or who direct the construction of the model. That's an obvious statement, right? But it's something that governments have to increasingly think about. And there isn't necessarily a robust space for that kind of thought yet. I would say it's fair to say that lots of people are making sales pitches to lots of political leaders in a way that says, these are the tools of the future. Thou shalt always have blockchain on hand, right? That's not really what we need. It's a tool or it's a device, but if it's not well used or not thoughtfully applied, then what's the point at all? So yes, it's a great comment, and it's certainly something that we're thinking about, and others across government are thinking about as well.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I have a page of questions, but unfortunately, we'll have to wrap up this section and hope that it's the beginning of some more conversations. It's been wonderful to connect with your colleague Blair around some of these issues as well, and just excited that the Digital Innovation Office is there asking good questions and hopefully moving the needle along. So thank you so much for your work and for joining us today.
Thanks so much.